Roman legionary. The image of unyielding discipline, gleaming armor, and precise formations lives in our imagination. A warrior bringing the light of civilization on the tip of his sword. But what if we set aside this polished image refined over centuries and look into his hands? What tools were truly used to build the greatest empire in history? Were they merely effective weapons, or were they designed with cold, calculated cruelty? Not just to kill, but to intimidate, inflict maximum damage, and break the enemy's spirit? We will speak not of armor that protected the legionary, but of weapons that maimed the enemy. Blades engineered to inflict horrific internal wounds, darts impossible to extract from shield or body, siege engines that sowed panic and death from afar, and those invisible, yet no less cruel tools that transformed ordinary men into ruthless machines of conquest. This is the story of how engineering and military tactics merged to create an arsenal unmatched for centuries. Forget noble duels. We are plunging into the mud, blood, and cold steel of battlefields stretching from Britain to Parthia. Are you ready to discover why a Roman short sword was more fearsome than a long barbarian blade? How a single throwing spear could disarm an entire enemy unit, and what was Rome's most terrifying weapon, even though it could not be held in human hands? Stay until the end to see the 10 most brutal weapons in the Roman soldier's arsenal. This is not merely a story about weapons. It is a story about the psychology of war, how cold calculation and ruthless efficiency became the foundation of the Roman Empire. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos about the Roman Empire. The gladius is undoubtedly the most recognizable symbol of the Roman legionary, his faithful companion and primary weapon in close combat. But don't let its relatively small size, typically around 50-60 centimeters, mislead you. This short sword was one of the most brutal and effective edged weapons of its time. Its design was perfected for one main purpose: to deliver swift, accurate, and deadly stabbing thrusts. Unlike the long swords of barbarians designed for sweeping cuts in open battle, the gladius was engineered for fighting in tight formation, shield to shield. If you could be a legionary for a day, what would you do? Write your answer in the comments. When legionaries closed with the enemy, protected by massive scutum shields, there was little room for wide swings. Here, the gladius revealed its terrifying efficiency. The legionary would make a short, rapid lunge from behind his shield, targeting areas unprotected by armor: the belly, groin, throat, armpits. The broad, leaf-shaped blade with a long point was ideally suited to inflict deep, penetrating wounds. It easily slid between ribs, ripped through the abdomen, causing massive internal bleeding and organ damage. Such a wound, unlike a slash, was almost always fatal under the conditions of ancient medicine. The enemy struck by a gladius often did not die immediately, but suffered in agony, a sight that demoralized his comrades. The Roman historian Titus Livius described with horror how the Macedonians, upon first encountering the effects of the gladius, were shocked by the sight of terrible wounds, severed limbs, and spilled entrails. The cruelty of the gladius lay in its intimacy. It was a weapon for killing at point-blank range, when you could see your enemy's eyes and feel his breath. A legionary had to possess not only strength, but also the cold composure to deliver those short, lethal thrusts again and again amid the bloody chaos of battle. The entire training system of the Roman soldier was designed to turn him into a ruthless and efficient killer. And the gladius was the perfect tool for this purpose. But before a legionary could wield his deadly sword, the enemy had to be disarmed and their ranks disrupted. For this, the Romans possessed other, equally insidious and cruel weapons. If the gladius was the legionary's final argument, the pilum was the first. This heavy throwing spear was not merely a weapon for striking enemy troops. Its design was an ingenious and brutal engineering solution aimed at disarming and demoralizing the enemy before hand-to-hand combat even began. The pilum was a dart approximately 2 meters long, consisting of a wooden shaft and a long, thin metal tip. The secret of the pilum lay in its tip. It was composed of 2 parts: a sharp, hardened point, and a long rod of soft, unhardened iron. Before battle, legionaries hurled their pila into enemy formations from 15-30 meters away. When the pilum struck an enemy shield, the following occurred. The sharp tip easily penetrated the wood, and the long, soft rod, due to the weight of the entire spear, bent under its own weight. As a result, it became nearly impossible to pull the pilum out of the shield on the battlefield. The enemy warrior faced a terrible choice. Either discard his heavy, now useless shield, to which a 2-meter lever now dangled, and remain unprotected before the advancing legionaries, or attempt to fight while dragging this cumbersome structure behind him. Both options were disastrous. Thus, a single volley of pila could instantly transform a solid wall of enemy shields into a chaotic, defenseless mob. The cruelty of the pilum was equally evident. If it struck flesh rather than shield, the long, thin tip inflicted a deep, penetrating wound, and the bent shaft made extracting the spear extremely painful and traumatic. The wound was often fatal. If not, the warrior was incapacitated for a long time. The psychological impact of seeing comrades nailed to their shields or writhing on the ground with spears protruding from their bodies was immense. Each legionary typically carried 2 pila, one heavier, one lighter, and used them at the very beginning of an assault to sow chaos and thin enemy ranks, after which they drew their gladi. This tactic was incredibly effective and became a hallmark of the Roman army. The pilum was not merely a weapon, it was a tool for cracking enemy defenses, as brutal and pragmatic as all Roman military art. But what if the enemy still withstood this deadly barrage and charged forward? Then something more than mere weapons came into play. The very wall the Romans themselves created. At first glance, the scutum appears merely a means of defense, a large rectangular or oval shield protecting the legionary from enemy blows. But in the hands of a Roman soldier, this piece of wood, covered in leather and reinforced with metal, became a universal and extremely brutal weapon, both defensive and offensive. The scutum was more than just a shield. It was a mobile wall, a battering ram, and brass knuckles all in one. Its large size, about 2 by 2 meters, and curved shape allowed a legionary to safely hide behind it. When shields were locked together, soldiers could form the famous testudo, tortoise, a formation virtually impervious to arrows and darts, which terrified the enemy. It was a powerful psychological weapon, but the ferocity of the scutum became evident in close combat. The legionary did not passively defend himself. He actively used his shield to attack. The lower edge of the scutum could forcefully strike an opponent's legs to knock him down or break his shin. The upper edge targeted the face and throat. But the most fearsome element was the umbo, a large metal boss at the center of the shield, usually hemispherical or conical in shape. The umbo served not only to protect the hand holding the shield, but also functioned as a real knuckle duster. A powerful direct blow from the umbo to an opponent's face or chest could stun, break the nose, jaw, or ribs, knock him off balance, and leave him open to a deadly thrust from the gladius. Roman tactics often boiled down to this simple yet incredibly effective and brutal combination: shield thrust, umbo strike, sword lunge. Thus, a legionary protected by a scutum became a kind of human tank, able to press against enemy formations, crush them, strike while remaining relatively safe. For a barbarian armed with a long sword or spear, colliding with such a living wall of shields was a nightmare. The scutum broke not only enemy spears, but also their fighting spirit. However, the Romans knew how to fight not only in tight formation. Their arsenal included other, more insidious means designed to stop the enemy at a distance, turning the ground beneath his feet into a minefield. Roman military thought was characterized not only by strength and discipline, but also by cunning. One of the most brutal yet simple examples of this approach was the caltrop, or tribulus, small but devilishly effective devices designed to create hidden traps on the battlefield. It was a weapon that needed neither to be thrown nor held. It simply waited for its victim, turning the earth into a deadly trap. The caltrop was a small metal device with 4 sharp spikes, engineered so that no matter how it landed, one spike always pointed vertically upward. The Romans mass-produced these unassuming yet terrible devices and liberally scattered them along the enemy's anticipated line of attack, especially on flanks where cavalry charges were expected or in front of fortifications during sieges. The cruelty of caltrops lay in their indiscriminate and torturous action. They were a true nightmare for cavalry. A horse stepping on a sharp spike suffered a severe hoof injury, fell, broke its legs, and incapacitated not only itself but also its rider, creating chaos in the attacking ranks. A single well-dispersed bag of caltrops could halt an entire mounted assault, turning it into a bloody heap of wounded men and animals. For infantry, they were no less dangerous. In the heat of battle, hidden in grass or mud, these tiny spikes were nearly invisible. A soldier stepping on a caltrop received a deep puncture wound to the foot. Even if the spike did not pierce the thick sole of his caligae sandals, it could become lodged, causing pain and impeding movement. In unsanitary conditions, any such wound could easily become infected, leading to gangrene and death. Caltrops were particularly effective against lightly clad or barefoot warriors of barbarian tribes. The Romans employed this insidious weapon during sieges, scattering it at the base of walls to hinder assaults, or during retreats to delay pursuing enemies. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, described the use of such traps. It was a silent, passive, yet extremely cruel weapon, causing pain, suffering, and chaos rather than instant death. But what if the enemy managed to overcome all these traps and close within striking distance for a final, desperate charge? In that case, the late imperial legionary had one more deadly surprise. In the arsenal of the late Roman Empire, as warfare tactics evolved, a new, insidious, and extremely cruel throwing weapon appeared. The plumbata, also known as Martiobarbulus, Mars' little dart. It was a short, heavy, lead-weighted dart that legionaries carried inside their shields and hurled at the enemy just before hand-to-hand combat. The plumbata consisted of a short wooden shaft about 30-70 centimeters long, with fletching at one end and a sharp metal tip at the other. Its key feature was a lead weight attached near the front of the shaft, which gave the dart considerable mass and penetrating power despite its small size. A legionary could carry several of these darts, usually up to 5, and throw them rapidly one after another. The cruelty of the plumbata lay in its surprise and effectiveness at close range. When the enemy, having already passed through the zone of pilum fire, charged for a final assault, the Romans met them with a rain of these deadly darts. Light and compact, they flew at tremendous speed, and thanks to the lead weight, possessed enough energy to pierce leather or even chainmail armor. A hit to the body inflicted a severe wound. The fletching stabilized flight for accuracy, and the sharp tip easily penetrated flesh. For an enemy unprepared for such a greeting, in the final moments of battle, a plumbata volley was a genuine shock. This weapon sowed panic, thinned attacking ranks, and gave legionaries a decisive advantage in the first, most critical seconds of close combat. The historian Vegetius, describing this weapon, noted that soldiers armed with plumbatae served as a kind of light infantry, capable of inflicting damage before swords were drawn. It was simple to manufacture, cheap, yet extremely effective, perfectly suited to the defensive tactics of the late empire. The plumbata is a prime example of how Roman military thought constantly adapted, creating ever more sophisticated and brutal ways to destroy the enemy. Yet the true power of Rome was not only embodied in the individual weapons of its infantrymen, but also in their ability to wreak havoc over vast distances, turning sieges into living hell for defenders. In the arsenal of every Roman legionary, alongside the gladius and pilum, there was a third, no less important element, the pugio dagger, At first glance, it was merely a weapon of last resort, a spare blade if the main sword was lost or broken in battle. However, the function of the Pugio was far broader, and its brutality manifested not in large-scale battles, but in the more intimate and darker aspects of war and peace. The Pugio was a broad, double-edged dagger with a leaf-shaped blade 15-30 cm long. This shape was ideal for delivering powerful stabbing blows capable of piercing leather armor or slipping between plates. In close quarters combat, where there was no room to swing a sword, the short, maneuverable Pugio could save its wielder's life. It could deliver a swift thrust to the neck, ribs, or joints of an enemy. But the true cruelty of the Pugio revealed itself outside the main phase of battle. It was with this dagger that legionaries often finished off wounded enemies lying on the battlefield. This was not a sadistic act, but a harsh military necessity. A wounded enemy could still be dangerous or might recover and return to the ranks. A short, merciful, or merciless, depending on one's perspective, Pugio strike ended suffering and eliminated a potential threat. Moreover, the Pugio was not only a soldier's tool, but also an officer's sidearm and a weapon carried in daily life. It served various household purposes, but could also become a murder weapon in drunken quarrels, during riots, or while carrying out secret orders. The broad blade of the Pugio left terrible, slow-healing wounds. According to one theory, it was this very dagger that killed Julius Caesar. The brutality of the Pugio is the brutality of up-close personal violence. It was not a weapon for battlefield glory, but for the dirty work that also had to be done. It was a symbol that war does not end with the victory cry. It continues in the groans of the wounded, in silent massacres, in the need to be ready for a knife in the back. Even within one's own camp, the Pugio reminded every legionary that the world he lived in was harsh and unforgiving of weakness. But if the Pugio was an instrument of individual terror, Rome also possessed means of mass terror, capable of crushing not individuals, but entire walls and armies. The Roman war machine was formidable not only for its legionaries, but also for its engineering. One of the most fearsome creations of this engineering genius was the ballista, a massive projectile launcher operating on the principle of a crossbow, but possessing monstrous power and remarkable accuracy for its time. It was the true mechanical sniper of antiquity, sowing death and destruction from great distances. The ballista operated by the energy of twisted bundles of sinew, hair, or rope, driven by two levers. It could launch both massive iron-tipped bolts and stone balls. Depending on its size, a ballista could strike targets several hundred meters away. Smaller ballistae, scorpions or caraballistae mounted on carts, were used to target individual enemy soldiers, while larger siege ballistae could penetrate wooden fortifications and even damage stone walls. The cruelty of the ballista lay in its impersonal yet inescapable destructive power. For an enemy soldier standing on the wall of a besieged city or packed tightly in formation on the battlefield, nothing was more terrifying than the whistle of a flying bolt capable of piercing through multiple men or shredding shield and armor. Death by ballista was instantaneous and horrific. The Romans skillfully employed ballistae in both field battles and sieges. A battery of several dozen ballistae could maintain constant, exhausting fire, preventing the enemy from raising their heads, covering the actions of assault troops and sappers. It was a weapon of psychological pressure, demonstrating Rome's technological superiority and the inevitability of its offensive. Julius Caesar used ballistae extensively during the Gallic War and at the Siege of Alesia. The accuracy of some ballistae was such that they were used to kill enemy commanders or operators of siege engines. Imagine the horror of a commander realizing that an invisible, relentless mechanical killer was aiming at him from 300-400 meters away. It undermined morale and crushed the will to resist. The ballista epitomized the Romans' cold, calculated, and technological approach to warfare. But while the ballista was an instrument of precision terror, another tool in the Roman arsenal was designed for total destruction and massed fire. If the ballista was the ancient world's sniper rifle, the onager was its heavy howitzer. This powerful siege engine, whose name translates as wild ass due to its violent recoil, resembling a kick, was designed not for precision shooting, but for hurling heavy projectiles along a high trajectory. Its targets were not individual soldiers, but walls, rooftops, and concentrations of enemy troops. The onager was a weapon of total destruction and psychological terror. It consisted of a massive wooden frame with a single lever powered by a bundle of twisted sinew or rope. At the end of the lever was a sling or spoon holding the projectile. When released, the lever struck a limiting bar with tremendous force, launching the projectile in a parabolic arc toward the enemy. The onager could hurl stone balls weighing 50-80 kilos over several hundred meters. Its cruelty lay in its indiscriminate action. A massive stone projectile falling from the sky could smash through rooftops, burying inhabitants under rubble, crush battle formations, leaving a bloody pulp where a dense rank once stood, and destroy siege towers and enemy battering rams. Defense against such a blow was nearly impossible. The sound of a flying projectile and the thunder of its impact terrified besieged defenders, eroding their will to resist. But the Romans did not limit themselves to stones. The onager's sling could also launch other, even crueler, gifts: large clay pots filled with flammable mixtures, Greek fire that shattered on impact, igniting fires within the besieged city. Or at the height of psychological warfare, severed heads of enemy ambassadors or prisoners, and corpses of people and animals who had died of disease, to spread epidemics in the enemy camp. The use of onagers during sieges turned them into hell. Constant bombardment, destruction, fires, the threat of plague, all exhausted defenders robbed them of sleep and hope. The onager was not merely a weapon, it was an instrument of terror, designed to break the spirit of the besieged and force surrender. It was a crude but extremely effective demonstration of Roman military power and ruthlessness. Yet the brutality of the Roman army manifested not only in the power of its machines but also in its very structure, the system that turned men into perfect soldiers. By the late Empire, the classical legionary with his gladius and scutum began to give way to a new type of warrior, and with him, weaponry changed. The short stabbing gladius was replaced by the long slashing sword, the spatha. Originally the weapon of Roman cavalry, it gradually came into use among infantry as well. This shift in armament reflected changes in warfare tactics and brought a new kind of brutality to the battlefield. The spatha was significantly longer than the gladius. Its blade could reach 70-80 centimeters and had a more pronounced cutting orientation, though it retained the ability to thrust. Changing tactics, looser battle formations, and the increased role of cavalry in clashes with barbarian peoples who favored cutting weapons made the spatha more relevant than the gladius, designed for tight formation combat. The cruelty of the spatha lay in the nature of the wounds it inflicted. While the gladius left relatively small but deep puncture wounds, the spatha caused horrific slashing and chopping injuries. A powerful spatha strike could sever a limb, shatter a helmet and skull, or leave deep, bleeding gashes across the body. Combat with the spatha was bloodier, more chaotic, and visually horrifying than gladius fencing. The transition to the spatha also meant a change in fighting technique. Instead of short thrusts from behind the shield, the late imperial legionary had to master techniques of cutting, dodging, and parrying. Combat became more individualized and less dependent on tight formations. This required greater mobility and skill, but also exposed the soldier to greater danger. The spatha became a symbol of a new era, an era of constant warfare on the frontiers, barbarian invasions, and the transformation of the Roman army. It was a weapon adapted to new realities, more versatile, yet more barbaric in nature. It no longer possessed the laconic, utilitarian brutality of the gladius. It carried a fury and scope that reflected the chaos and brutality of the age. But perhaps Rome's most important and most brutal weapon was not any specific blade or machine, but something far more fundamental and all-encompassing. When discussing the brutality of Roman weaponry, one cannot overlook the two most vital, most powerful, and perhaps most ruthless instruments that ensured Rome's dominance for centuries. They were not swords or catapults, but two abstract yet pervasive concepts: iron discipline and unrivaled military engineering. It was these that transformed the Roman army from a mere collection of armed men into a single, crushing machine of war. Roman discipline was legendary, built on a combination of rewards and extremely cruel punishments. For cowardice in battle, losing a standard, or disobeying orders, soldiers faced execution. The most infamous and horrifying punishment was decimation, the execution by lot of every 10th man in a disgraced unit. Imagine the horror of legionaries forced to stone or club to death comrades with whom they had shared a tent and meals just the day before. The fear of such punishment was greater than the fear of the enemy. It drove them to fight with desperate courage. This brutal system created soldiers ready to obey any order without complaint, to march to certain death, to build fortifications under a hail of arrows. Discipline enabled complex tactical maneuvers, maintain formation under enemy assault, and allowed the army to act as a single organism. This organization and predictability made the legions virtually invincible against the more chaotic barbarian armies. Military engineering was the second component of this machine. The Romans knew not only how to fight, but also how to build. In a matter of days, they could erect fortified camps, bridge wide rivers, cut roads through impassable forests, and construct the most complex siege engines, towers, rams, ramparts. An army that arrived with its own fortress, capable of reshaping the landscape and overcoming any obstacle, inspired enemies with a sense of hopelessness. A siege by the Romans meant not just battle, but methodical, systematic strangulation. The combination of these two factors, disciplined soldiers and advanced engineering, was Rome's most brutal weapon. It enabled total war, aimed not merely at winning a battle, but at completely subjugating and destroying the enemy's will to resist. The Roman army carried not only death, but order, its own Roman order, established by iron, stone, and unquestioning obedience. It was this weapon that built the empire. The arsenal of the Roman soldier is not merely a collection of deadly tools. It is an entire philosophy of warfare embodied in metal and wood. Every weapon, from the short gladius to the giant onager, was the result of cold, pragmatic calculation aimed at maximizing efficiency. In this efficiency lay their chief cruelty, not in sadism, but in a utilitarian approach to destroying the enemy, leaving no room for sentiment or chivalry. Gladius, pilum, scutum, caltrop, ballista, all were links in the same chain, elements of a system that allowed the Roman army to dominate the battlefield for centuries. But as we have seen, the most fearsome weapon was the system itself. Iron discipline, advanced engineering, and the ability to turn thousands of individuals into a single ruthless mechanism, crushing everything in its path. By studying these weapons, we better understand not only how the Romans fought, but also how they thought and how they built their empire. Their arsenal reflected the essence of their civilization: order, pragmatism, ruthlessness toward enemies, and belief in their own superiority. It was a brutal era, and its weapons matched it. If you found this dive into the harsh world of Roman military art compelling and wish to learn more about how warriors of the past fought, lived, and died, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Many more stories about the most formidable armies and deadliest technologies in human history await you.